Today we are here with the former Prime Minister of Australia, father of two, and member for my local area, Cook, the Honourable Scott Morrison. Thanks for coming on.
G'day, Sam, and well, mate, call me ScoMo.
Oh.
That's how everyone knows me around here, as you know.
It's quite relaxed around this area of the beaches.
It is. It's wonderful to be back home after some pretty torrid years as Prime Minister, and to be back in the Shire and walking the dog up at Green Hills and all those sort of things. It's it's, as far as I'm concerned, I suspect you may agree. It's probably the best place in the country to live.
Oh, very, very relaxing, man. I need de-stress. I come home.
You come home.
That's my first question. What have you been doing since you've been Prime Minister? What have you been up to?
I've continued to be in the Parliament as the member for Cook, and like any member of Parliament, regardless of how they go on to serve, whether it be as a minister or in my case a Prime Minister, your first job in politics is to be a local member. And for me, that was back in 2007 when I was elected here for the first time as the member for Cook, and which at that time pretty much encompassed all the Eastern Shire, just east of Sutherland all the way down to Cronulla. These days they changed the boundaries a few years back, and it leapt the river, Georges River, and sort of goes up to sort of Sandringham and down to Blakers.
Quite a large area.
Yeah, well, all electorates have around about 100,000 or so people, electors in them. That means a lot more people who live there, 150,000 or so people who live there. And so, federal electorates are much bigger than state electorates, but that's fine. I think that's appropriate. I mean, there's a suggestion at the moment that they want to have more federal politicians. I don't think so. I think we've got plenty. You can comfortably and look after an area of that size, but I can get from one end of my electorate to the other in about 15, 20 minutes. I have colleagues in the Parliament who have to get on a charter plane and fly for several hours, in Western Australia or in South Australia or places like that in the Territory. It's as a member for an urban electorate, and particularly one like this, which has the best beaches, national park, all the rest of it. It's it's a real blessing.
It's not too bad, this area.
Oh, it's awesome. And so your first job is as a local member of Parliament, and so that's what I've principally been doing. That's my first responsibility. But in that, as continuing to be a member of Parliament, I've continued to be very active in a couple of issues pretty dear to my heart.
What are those?
Well, the Indo-Pacific, and Australia engages there. We put a lot of important relationships in place there in our own region, with Japan, with India, the United States, the Pacific Island nations in particular. We did a lot of work there, especially PNG. Then across through Southeast Asia. Energy issues, resources, how the new economy is going to work as you go towards net zero by 2050. I mean, some people may have forgotten that I was the Prime Minister who committed us to net zero by 2050 at the COP26 in Glasgow with Prime Minister Johnson, who's a good friend of mine.
And we've stuck on that path since.
Yeah, we have. I mean, the new government's legislated it, but legislating doesn't make it happen. Doing it makes it happen. And of all the things that we were able to achieve, I mean, we're able to reduce emissions by over 20% from 95 levels, which far outstripped the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, so many other countries. And despite all the hype about this issue, we were just getting the job done.
Yeah. One of your sayings that I've heard you say that I like is, when you have a go, you
get a go.
You get a go.
I think that's sort of fundamental to how Australians look at the world, because we're a bit different.
You have a crack, right?
You do, and fairness means different things to different people and in different cultural settings. I've spent a fair bit of time in the United States since the last election, and in the United Kingdom. Reason for that is I put together an international agreement called AUKUS, Australia, UK, United States.
What was it like pulling that together?
Oh, well, I'll come back to it, but it was very.
I'm interested.
It was very, very difficult. So I've spent a bit of time in the UK and the US. Since no longer being PM and serving in the Parliament, promoting those sorts of agreements. And
I've seen you with Boas.
Sorry?
I've seen you with Boas.
Yeah. Well, he's a good mate, and we were in Israel together pretty recently, standing by Israel and the terrorist attacks against Israel back on October 7. But a fair go for those who have a go. If you have a go, you get a go. What that essentially means is you've got to put in to take out. There's no free riding. We all, and this is, I think these are Shire values personally. People here work hard, but they also give back. They volunteer. They're at local surf clubs. They're in the Rural Fire Service. They run the local football clubs, particularly soccer, which is huge down here.
The first time we actually met was at
Yeah.
one of those events.
It's called Community Classic, down with all the surf clubs, down at Cronulla. And that's true. So, but people work hard here too. And so when people succeed, they feel that they should be giving back to the community. And equally, if they're prepared to go out and have a crack, well, they don't expect sort of people to get in their way or hold them back or talk them down. And that's how our country should be. I think that's what we aspire to. But the idea that you just sort of show up and say, well, what am I entitled to? Well, no, that's not how our country should work. I don't believe it is how it does. I think there's always a great risk that we could lose that idea, that everyone just expects everything to be handed to them on a plate.
We get a harsh reality of that when we compete. You turn up and you think you've done enough and you haven't. Like you find out and you go back and you have another go. You have another crack.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said. I mean, this in your sporting career. You don't land every dive. You don't know. Is that the right term?
Nail it. That's the one.
You don't nail every dive, but you keep going, and that's why you practice so hard. And some tournaments, some competitions, you're gonna absolutely succeed. Other times, you may not make the cut. I mean, look at Cam Smith, one of my favourite golfers. He at the Australian Open, and up there in Queensland at the PGA, he didn't have the best tour down under. But he won the British Open a couple of years ago. So, you have your good days and your bad days. And I think with that fair go for those who have a go, that's also about understanding that, sometimes you fail. And, we can be a bit harsh on failure. You don't succeed unless you've failed. And you'd know that as a professional, elite athlete.
Those tough days when you even look in the mirror and you're like, can I do this? Like, am I able to get there?
Yeah.
And then you go back to work, you make a plan and you get through. I feel like that's what builds your character.
It totally builds your character. And if there's one thing that, if I compare what it was like when I was your age, I'm not going to sit here and give good fatherly advice. You don't need any.
There was a day. We were the same age.
But we could all say that. We're all young once. Just you try and feel it for as long as you can. But what I noticed with sort of my generation versus yours is that I think there's far much more pressure on your generation than when I was your age.
Why's that?
I mean, look, yeah, we had pressure too. That things were different. And if I go back to my parents' and grandparents' generation, you go back to my grandparents' generation, he was fighting in the war.
That's difficult.
And my dad grew up during the war and the depression and all these sorts of things. So times change, but the current generation, I think, has a lot of pressure put on them. But I think it pulls a lot of pressure on them as well.
Like unneeded pressure?
Yeah, I mean, expectations around, what they'll do and, not failing. I worry that young people are scared of failure and therefore don't have a go. Failure is part of life. I've had plenty of failures. I've had plenty of successes. I've won, I've lost, I've been right, I've been wrong. That's how you push ahead. And if there's one thing I'd hope for young people is that they just mightn't feel that and just feel confident in themselves and have a go, and people around them support them through failure and success. In my political career, but more broad career, I found people were often more vulnerable when they'd succeeded.
Really?
They'd often, they get a bit full of themselves. They make a few mistakes. They get a bit carried away. Don't appreciate their vulnerabilities. Whereas, if you've lost, your vulnerabilities are pretty obvious, and it hurts, and it's disappointing. But if you have the right attitude, you get back on and off you go.
It's not like you'd be right. I feel like you're going to fail. It's just part of it,
Yeah.
and just pushing forward anyway. And even when I've just lost the comp and I know I'm going to go back and train for a few months, acknowledging, these next couple of months are going to be tough, and just I'm going to get through it. And
you apply yourself. There's something on the other side. And I know when my daughter's, my oldest daughter's going into year 11 next year, and we're just working through what elective subjects we're going to be, and you've got to pick the right subjects. That's all true, and that helps with your ATAR and then what university you're going to go to, but that's a lot of decisions for someone who's 16, for goodness sake. And so, I just encouraged her to pick things that she enjoyed doing, that interested her, that she had a clear talent for, and, let the rest take care of itself.
That's all you can sort out, right? That moment you have, what you have at hand, it's all you can control. And if you keep making the right decisions.
Yeah. Well, when I did my HSC, last century.
Was it called HSC back then? Or that?
It was. ATARs didn't exist. And when we did our HSCs, it was just one exam. That was it.
How many hours?
How many hours, what do you mean?
Yeah, like you just come in, sit one exam.
Yeah, you'd sit one exam over 3 hours, I think it
Okay.
was, in each of your subjects.
Yeah.
But your HSC was 100% determined by how you went on that one exam.
That's performance.
Yeah, and so and I mean that's where it is different. I mean that put enormous pressure on kids for their HSC back then. At least now, if you work hard over the 2 years, that's recognised. For crammers, that old system actually worked pretty well. Probably worked out all right for me.
That would have been good for me too.
I was a good crammer, and so
I feel like that becomes good when you're more busy though, because you get more done.
Well, what they say, if you want something, don't ask a busy person, because they're used to operating at those levels. But so, but the basic point I was hoping to make was, have a go. Don't be afraid to have a go. Don't be afraid of failure. But be respectful of success, because sometimes success can injure you more than failure.
When you became Prime Minister, how did you manage that for yourself?
Look, the biggest influences on my life are faith and family. My Christian faith, which I embraced when I was quite young, I was 12, and it's been the centre of my life ever since. And so I've sort of been involved around my local church communities, my own sort of prayer life and spiritual life, and a key teaching in my Christian faith is humility. Now, people listening to this go, "Oh, I didn't think you were that humble." Well, maybe that's the case. Maybe that's how I come across. I don't know. But I can tell you that I was always very wary of power and very wary of what it could do to you. And so humility, I think, is one of the most important things you need in life. It keeps you real. It keeps your feet on the ground. And family and friends are the other. When I went into Parliament back in 2007, each time a new year comes in, they get one of the members of Parliament who came in the previous term to talk to the new members and say, "Look, here's a couple of tips." And I'll never forget the advice that we were given on that day. And she said, "Look, you've come here and you've got a whole bunch of friends right now, and you've been sharing your life with them. That's the most important thing, because when you leave here, if you still have them, they'll be the only people who'll be there."
Really?
Politics is a very brutal business, and you make friends during political life, but it's the friends you came in with outside politics that will be the most enduring. That's certainly been my experience. And so Julie Owens, who was the then member for Parramatta, made this point. Take the time to continue to invest in your friendships, to stay in contact. You'll be busy, so call them when you're driving down to Canberra. Call them here and there. Make sure you catch up for those dinners or a beer at the pub or whatever, or go to the footy together or whatever you're doing, and for your family. And when you do those things, so faith and family combined has always kept me pretty centred, and I hope has given me a bit of a spirit of humility.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good message for anyone who is rising, like keeping those day one people that are around you, because if they're there before,
they'll be there after, and there'll be plenty who'll join the bus along the way, and many of them will come and go, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've had had many great working relationships over my time in politics and in pre-political sort of career, and stay in touch with many of them. But the deep friendships are the ones that you form, probably at your time of life. Certainly that was the case for me at university and things like that. And and they've remained, and they're dear friends to this day.
Yeah, I've found a lot of my good friends through my diving, my sport, and those have stuck with me. Even if those guys have retired, and then as everything grows on the side, you can always lean on them.
And the relationships quickly sort of reignite.
And you haven't seen them in a while?
You haven't seen them
That's
in
like
a
a good
while.
mate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of really good mates. I went to Sydney Boys, and I was a keen rugby player and rower at Sydney Boys. So I enjoyed my sport quite a lot. That's why cramming was good for me. I spent 2 years playing rugby and doing rowing and other things, and then I better study for the
I can understand that. Yeah.
And when I was PM, I texted a few of my mates from high school, just 3 or 4 mates. I said, I'd love to have you around to Kirribilli for dinner. And 2 of them were in Queensland at the time playing golf. I think they pretty much walked off the course, jumped on a plane and came straight down. And a few others. And look, we hadn't seen each other for some time, but the conversation picked up like it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. And so value your friendships, appreciate your family. And I would heartily recommend a strong spiritual life and a strong faith.
I've actually been down to your church once before.
Horizon.
Yeah, it's a nice one. I have some friends that go there.
Great people, great people.
Now, I wanted to jump on an interesting topic I've always wondered about. Yeah. Meeting world leaders.
Oh, yeah.
So, when you're flying into the United States on the plane, you're about to meet the president. Yep. What's going through your head? How are you feeling?
Well, I dealt with 2 presidents, President Biden and President Trump, 2 of the most intriguing of all time.
I was going to ask you about the difference.
They're quite different. Look, there's a couple of things. The first thing is they're people like anyone else. They're people like you. They've come through politics just like you have. The US might be a bigger stage, but our politics is no less brutal, no less demanding in many, many respects. And so whether it's there or, the Prime Minister of Singapore or Prime Minister of Japan or the UK or President of France, or these are all necessary parts of the job. And sometimes politicians, particularly Prime Ministers, get a hard time for going and doing these things, but they are important.
International relations is surely one of the most important things
And the Prime Minister has to carry it. I mean, you have a Foreign Minister and they're really important. I had a fantastic Foreign Minister in Maurice Payne, and I worked closely with Julie Bishop, who was before Maurice, and they were both great Foreign Ministers. But at the end of the day, the country's relationships are carried by their leaders. And so it is important to do these things. So, I'll be... In partisan politics, we're often critical of each other, but you won't find me too often, if at all, ever being critical of a Prime Minister who needs to go and meet with another world leader. I might have a view about where they should do it and what they should be talking about, but it is necessary that they do it. It's unfortunate that many of these big events that happen, they all happen at sort of one time of the year, so you always look like you're away. So every Prime Minister has to wrestle with that, but you can't complain about it. That's the job, and people give you a hard time. So suck it up and move on.
Something I've found is just not in politics is when I see 2 world leaders together, I think to myself, okay, good. Like our country's friends with that country. Yeah, that's good for us.
Well, that is true. The tone of the relationship, though, is really important. And I'll come back to that. But to answer your question, how do you prepare? Well, you realise they're just the same as you. So I can't say I've ever felt nervous or intimidated.
Really? When you were flying into the US to meet the president or anywhere, you weren't nervous?
No.
Fair enough.
No, not really. Because and maybe it goes back to my faith, but, we're all people. We all, put our pants on one leg at a time. And we've all had our own journeys through politics and our own struggles. We've all had our failures and successes. No one sort of, has any sort of great mortgage on wisdom. And we all come from our own perspectives. So no, I wasn't particularly fussed by that. It's just been something that I've never really contended with for whatever reason. I can't explain it.
That would have been good going into it then.
Yeah, so you're not so much worried about that. But a couple of things. I mean, you always try and make a good personal relationship. Even if there might be, tensions, you try to make a good personal connection. But then you've got to be careful when you're leading a country. The thing that matters most is your country's interests.
Yep.
And so as good a mate as you might be, and we all understand this about each other, I expect, and let's take Boris. Boris Johnson, love the guy. He's great company.
Crazy hair.
Yeah. And, great instincts when it comes to the things that matter, and really enjoyed working with him. But at the end of the day, I always knew that Boris was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he had to put what was best for the United Kingdom first. And I had to put what was best for Australia first. And that meant, occasionally, that means we weren't going to agree. And now we weren't going to agree just because, we liked each other, that we would have not been doing our jobs. And so you sort of have to understand that. The personal relationship cannot trump, pardon the phrase, your own personal relationship. Your personal cannot trump the strategic national interests of your country. So to that end, what I would do as a keen swatter is I always tried to make sure I was completely across everything, all the details of the relationship, all the facts and figures, and I would study intently. I got this advice very early on in my political career. There's no substitute for hard work. It's a bit like you and your training and your drills and all of that. You put the hours in off the field or off the diving board or out of the pool, and it really pays off when you're there. And politics is no different. You're constantly being questioned in the media, in the parliament. You're in these meetings, and I remember when I was doing the trade deal with Boris, we argued back and forth.
What was that trade deal about for anyone listening?
Oh, this was the first trade deal that the United Kingdom entered into with any country in the world after Brexit. So previously, the United Kingdom was part of Europe, and all of their trading arrangements, so what tariffs and various things, so tariffs are basically taxes.
That's what we tax their imports into our country.
That's right, and that's what they tax on us selling them beef and sheep meat and lamb and so on, and every wheat and manufactures, electronic goods, all those sort of things, as well as services and accounting services, architectural services.
And were they based off? Because I know sometimes they can be used as if a country's doing something against us, we can up tariffs. What do we use them for standardly?
Well, they were originally introduced to try and ensure that your domestic industries, what was made locally, would be able to get a good price and was protected from competition from overseas. Now, I've always believed in more open and free trade because that means you can get Australia can't produce everything.
And we're quite a service-based country, right?
Well, yes and no. Yes, we are. But similarly, we're a massive resources producer, a massive agricultural producer, a massive energy exporter. And you take our relationship with China. I mean, the dominant aspect of our trade with China is resources.
Is that relation better now these days?
I'll come back to that, but just on what you were asking about. So on the UK free trade agreement. So this was the first time all of their trade arrangements, tariffs, trading rules, and there's another thing called quotas, which means you can only sell so much weight of a particular product or so many units of a particular product in the country at any time. So tariffs, taxes, quotas, limits are the two. So it's a bit like when you go on fishing and there's a bag limit. And so Boris and I had.
I like the simplification.
Boris and I had to negotiate this agreement. Now there'd been a lot of work that had gone into it before with our ministers, but we had to finalise the deal. And Boris and I were going backwards and forwards on, how much sheep and beef meat in how many years, what were the quotas, what were the tariffs, and we both argued the case pretty hard, and we eventually got there, and we struck an agreement, and that just sort of goes to show us we were having the conversation in good faith with a good relationship, but we were both arguing our team's case. And so whether it was with President Trump or President Biden, where we need to make sure that Australia's sort of sovereignty and independence is respected, but equally we continue to strengthen the most important relationship we have as a country is with the United States. I mean, there are people who think, what if the Chinese invade? We should be able to defend ourselves all our own. There's not a country in the world that can do that other than the United States. So this idea that there's all these sovereign nation states around the world that has a defence force that's capable of resisting the second largest or thereabouts military in the world is ridiculous. For Western countries, democracies, we have always been able to defend ourselves by having strong alliances with good friends who share values, and there's no greater partner or ally than the United States. So that US relationship is incredibly important.
When it comes to people, because fortunately with my diving, I'll be able to travel around the world a fair bit and meet a wide range of people. I find most people just want the same things. They want their family. They want to be happy. They want to be free. When, say, conflicts happen, is that sometimes the leaders, because you meet a lot of people day to day and you get along?
Sometimes it's history. Sometimes it's culture. Sometimes it's politics. Sometimes it's greed. I mean, you look at the Sudan at the moment and what's happening there. It's basically a bunch of warlords squabbling over, power and money, and millions of people are starving and dying. Then you look at conflicts like in the Middle East. They're ancient. They go back over centuries, and in modern history, go back to the Balfour Declaration and what happened after the Second World War. So there's history. There's all of these things, and they're not easily soluble. But you always try. You always try.
Keep having a go.
Well, you do keep having a go. You don't always get a go. That's in international relations. I mean, you asked before about the relationship with China, and
because we're a big trade partner with them.
We are, and we want to be, but we're not going to allow, and we shouldn't allow, the fact that we have such a big economic relationship with them, have them set the terms about how we run our country, and to give them undue influence and control. Which is, when I was Prime Minister, what they were seeking to do. They were seeking to coerce us. They were trying to bully us into being, basically a compliant state in the region, and not frustrate their ambitions or goals, which was to extend their influence and an economic power within the region.
Have they stepped back a little bit from that?
They've changed their tactics, but I don't think they've changed their objective. The difference between our relationship with China and the United States, I mean, relationships can be conformed on many things. Our relationship with the United States, and Great Britain for that matter, and many other countries, particularly Western countries, but I'd include Japan, Singapore in that category. These relationships are based on shared values, a shared way of looking at the world, democracy, rule of law, individual freedom, political freedom, religious freedom, economic freedom. These are values that we share. Then we have a whole range of economic interests. I mean, if you ask people today, who do you think is the biggest investor in Australia from overseas? Many people would think it's China. China's way down the list. There have been a lot more Chinese investment in recent times, in the last decade or so.
Who is the biggest?
US.
What kind of things do they invest in?
The US, literally everything. They are in everything and have been for a very long time. The UK as well. The US and the UK are the biggest investors in Australia. The Japanese investment in Australia. But the US is far and away the biggest investor and has the biggest holdings in Australia. They've invested in our industries, in our agriculture, in our technology, in our defence capabilities, and all of these things. So you can have a relationship with another country that's based on shared values and shared interests. They're the best relationships. They're the enduring relationships. Then you can have a relationship with countries just based on a transactional interest where you don't share values, and it's hard. While I think people-to-people relations with China and Australia are very good, we have a very large ethnic Chinese diaspora in Australia.
Did you meet Xi Jinping?
Yeah, I did on a couple of occasions. Not in the same way that our Prime Minister has. They were more informal meetings. I met him in Papua New Guinea. I met him down in Argentina.
What was that interaction like? Because you also, those where you don't speak the same language, is that also difficult?
Well, you get used to dealing with interpreters.
Yep.
And his interpreter was pretty good. And so I remember on one occasion, the first time I met him was in Papua New Guinea, and we were just in what's called the Leaders' Lounge, and we were just sitting there having a chat, just the two of us. And all of my interactions with him, he struck me as an incredibly able politician.
Very smart.
Yeah, he knew what he wanted. He knew where he was going, and And so I respected that. But as time wore on, the sort of charismatic exterior gave way to a more autocratic, authoritarian sort of outlook on the region, and where we didn't line up if I said something that was critical of what was happening in Hong Kong or Taiwan or Xinjiang, or they were holding Australians prisoner and things like this. They would get very upset about it, and then they started to coerce us, and they started to bully us because we just simply didn't go along with their script and didn't sign up to a thing called the Belt and Road Initiative, which was effectively their empire building process, which they've signed many countries up to around the world, saddled them up with debt, and then repossessed things like their ports and taken them into their own possession.
When you have so many concerns as Prime Minister and then you move on and someone else comes in, do you have more concerns because you know what's going on? Or do you have less and hope
probably.
that they can sort it?
Well, look, it is a mixture of both, but probably more. You're more aware of what's at stake, and you can read what the other party is doing, and you've got to be very careful. Look, I think I'm pleased that the government is now talking to the Chinese government, but we've got to be careful that we don't let the presentation of that being used as a sort of, for example, when I was Prime Minister, China's strategy was to isolate Australia and use us as a sort of an example of what happens to Western countries when they don't toe the line. And so we resisted, we pushed back. That sort of wasn't on their game plan, and it frustrated them.
How do you push back against that?
On everything from insisting that COVID had an international inquiry into its origins, through to stopping them from interfering in our universities and changing courses, to basically push Communist Party rhetoric in amongst the diaspora of Chinese students in Australia, them trying to inappropriately influence our politics in Australia, which I know they do, and their inappropriate investments in Australia, which compromised our sovereignty and security, which as Treasurer and as Prime Minister, we made sure that we pushed back on those, and they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. And at that time, they were trying to break us, and so we stood up to them. And that gave us great respect, particularly amongst our allies in the United States and Japan and India. India at the time was actually involved in a hot conflict with China at the time on their border. So we pushed back. That ultimately failed, China's attempt. And so what I think China tries to do now, and we have to be careful of in our relationship with them, which has thawed, and that's a good thing, is not allow that thawing to be presented as isolating our partner and ally in the United States and saying, well, we can get on Australia now. Why are the US being so belligerent? So, you've got to be conscious of all the, as I said, Xi Jinping is a smart and canny operator, and I know what he wants, and he is intent on doing it. And we can't allow ourselves to be used wittingly or otherwise for that purpose, and you always have to stick with your friends.
Stick to your mates is a
stick to your mates. And while we can have a very good relationship with China, it'll ultimately be transactional and interest-based. It's not values-based, not with their government. I think it potentially could be values-based with their people. I mean, some people say that...
Because Chinese people, I've met a lot of them, incredible people.
Fantastic.
My synchro partner actually with diving he is Chinese-Australian.
Yeah, there's a view that some put around that, democracy can't work in Chinese culture. Well, it's crap. I've been to Taiwan. Taiwan would be arguably one of the most strident and passionate democracies in the world.
And they've got the really strong microchips.
Yeah, they do. They've got the semiconductors. But the point about, they're a country that prizes their democracy and their institutions. They weren't always like that. You go back 30 years ago, there was authoritarian rule there, and not communist, but authoritarian rule. There was martial law. There was all these sorts of things. But they have evolved into a vibrant, thriving democracy that really values it. And, they got Chinese planes flying over them all the time, and Chinese naval ships threatening them on a daily basis. And so they live in an environment where their democracy is under constant physical threat. And they value it, and particularly young people in Taiwan, because unlike their parents, they have grown up in a free Taiwan, and post-authoritarianism, and they like it. They don't want it to change, and China is seeking to unify Taiwan into the mainland China, and that would be at the great price of democracy and freedom in Taiwan. But there's nothing inherently anti-democratic in the ethnic genes of people of Chinese descent. They care just as much about freedom as we do. Sadly, in mainland China, they don't have the opportunity for it.
When you were Prime Minister of Australia, what's some of the work that you're most proud of doing?
Every single day, there's many demands on that job, but equally every day you could do something. That's what I loved about it. Whether it was the days we got Australian prisoners out of jails in Iran on more than one occasion, or out in Southeast Asia, whether it was the funding of major medical treatments, CAR T cell therapy down in Melbourne for cancer treatment, which was radical new treatment, and setting that up, whether it was the drugs we listed on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme for cystic fibrosis. There was a major program we invested in to do with endometriosis, which is suffered by so many women in Australia, and in fact my wife Jenny suffered from. So there were so many things you could do every day, whether it was in health or in education, in Indigenous policy. I'm really proud of the work that we did on supporting a program which is based here also in the Shire, called the CONTAF Academies, which we have been able to take from a few thousand boys a year to over 9,000 boys a year all around the country. We've multiplied the number of academies that are in schools. We've got one here at Endeavour High School. They're up in Townsville. They're over in the Western Australia.
And it's an ongoing thing.
It's an ongoing thing. That's just one example. There are many others in Indigenous policy, but there are a lot of those things. I mean, obviously the things that have been most prominent that people probably recall about, how we managed the country through COVID with JobKeeper and we enable all of our businesses and jobs to survive, which a day doesn't go past where someone somewhere doesn't come up and say thank you for that, which was our job to make sure they kept their jobs. And of course, the big security issues that we were able to advance through AUKUS, which was that big defence partnership, the biggest thing we've done in defence and security in over 70 years.
During COVID, tough time, no Prime Minister had ever had to deal with a pandemic. What was that like?
Well, not in 100 years, at least, anyway.
Yeah, okay.
And
not in my lifetime, that's for sure.
Or mine. And so, the last pandemic, with the Spanish flu.
Didn't that kill more than the world wars?
I think you're right. I think it did. And look, the COVID. I remember a figure struck me one day, and you talk about when you go and see other leaders. I remember I was reading a book during the pandemic about Churchill in his first year as Prime Minister, and I was reading the chapters on the Blitz. More people died from COVID in London, in the UK, than died during the Blitz, during the Second World War.
Really?
Yeah. So that sort of gives you an idea of the scale of what was occurring during COVID. I mean, after COVID, everyone sort of looked back, it wasn't such a big deal. No, it was a huge deal. It was a massive deal. And people can look on back and know everything about the virus we now know and sort of want to play Monday morning quarterback. But going into it, we had no idea what this was. We had no idea how lethal it was. It certainly was lethal because we were already seeing that.
Was that the most stressful part of the...
Yeah, it was. It was. The China issues were also very taxing, and that probably kept me up more nights than even COVID. But on COVID, in those early months, back in, I think it was 2012, we'd gone through SARS and MERS, which was also a coronavirus type. And
they were more localised.
That was in Asia, and that was very lethal. And we were able to prevent that, the government at the time. So in Asia, there was more of a consciousness about these things. I think in the Northern Hemisphere, Western countries, the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, they had a very different attitude towards COVID. I think in many ways it was very political. The libertarians and all this. All I knew is that the virus didn't have any political views. It didn't care how you voted. It didn't care what sort of a system you lived under, communist or democracy. It was easily transferable, and if you had any vulnerabilities, it could kill you, whether you were young or whether you were old. And so, we were trying to learn and understand how this thing moved around. And I was incredibly proud of our country, especially in those first 6 months, where everyone just sort of mucked in. And this is why JobKeeper was so important, because yes, there was the great physical threat to everybody. And so we're putting in place the health response, which dealt with that. And a lot of countries were just focusing on that. My bigger concern, I was confident we could sort of manage the health side of it, because we have a good health system. We have, great doctors, nurses, scientists, researchers, and so on. And so, we'll stay on top of this. We just got to protect our health system. Our policies was never about having zero COVID. What we wanted to avoid is what we were seeing overseas, which was our hospitals being overwhelmed. And
very scary.
It was terrifying. I saw those images coming out of northern Italy, and I knew that could happen in Australia. I mean, Italy's a sophisticated country with a sophisticated health system. UK the same, and all the rest of it. So there was nothing could be assumed that our system would just hold up. If this thing got legs in those early months when there was no vaccine, there'd never been a vaccine for coronavirus. So we're looking at no vaccine, something that we thought could kill a large number of people. It could overwhelm your hospital system. So when that happened, people started dying of lots of other things, not just COVID, because your whole hospital system and your health system crashed.
Knowing you were in charge of the country, well, that would have been hard.
Well, it was, but look, it's not the same as sport, but I suppose there is a similarity in this. When you know you've got something to do, you can choose to focus on the things that you can change, that you have influence over, and you choose not to allow the things that you can't control or you can't influence condition your environment. And I imagine you'd call that focusing and blocking it out.
Yeah.
You go into your tunnel.
Task at hand.
Yeah, and you look down that tunnel and that's what you're focused on.
Is that how you deal with all stress, pressures, challenging situations?
Yes, in short. As a Prime Minister or a leader or anything, you can't waste time endlessly talking about things that you cannot impact. You have to identify the things that you can to improve a situation and focus on what you can do. And then you spend the time on the things you don't know about, trying to know about them and trying to understand how you can start to influence those things. And you task a lot of people to go away and do things and bring stuff back to you. And that's how we did it. We just focused on each challenge, one after the other. There were short-term things. There were decisions we had to make in minutes. There were others took longer than that. And you've got to have good information. One of the things I did was I just ensured, well, you know what you need and you task it and you expect your people to do it. I mean, I had a great team, a lot of professionals, and I'd say, this is the information I need every day. You're going to ask me to make thousands of decisions. Well, in order to make those decisions, I need to know this.
I need the information.
So you get me that information and I want it on one A3 page. Use pictures if you need to, graphs, charts.
Love a good picture.
Yeah, dashboards. I said, I want to see this every day because I need to know how things are moving and changing. I need to understand the environment I'm trying to make decisions in. And my ministers needed the same thing, Greg Hunt and Josh Frydenberg and Michael McCormick and others who are involved directly. And we need to know all that.
So every morning you'd get your piece of paper with the information.
We'd go in meetings which would go for hours and hours and hours and hours. We'd have the national cabinet, so I'd be meeting with premiers for hours. I'd be meeting with my own ministers, my own officials, and this just went on day after day after day for months and months and months and months. But the good news is it worked. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was one of the most successful COVID responses anywhere in the world. I would prefer not to have been in Melbourne, to be honest, and I think that they overreached on things, particularly later in the piece. In the first 6 months, no one knew what was ahead of us. And so you had to be extremely cautious. As time went on, you got a bit more of knowledge about how the virus is working. You had more options. And so, states and territories were having a different experience of COVID. If you went to Western Australia or or Northern Territory, there wasn't much there.
I remember that stage. Each state might be 0 in Melbourne, 120
So you
in
couldn't have the
Adelaide.
same response in every place. I mean, and even, were borders good or bad internally? Well, it depends. The border in Western Australia, although it was difficult for people who had family on the East Coast, on balance now, I look back on that and say, no, that was a good idea. That worked for Western Australia. Did they have it there too long? Maybe. But, cut Mark McGowan some slack. They did very well in Western Australia. The border between New South Wales and Queensland was terrible.
I remember trying to cross one time and I needed my test within 72 hours, and they were taking, at the time, longer to get back over Christmas. It was just a really tough time for the system.
Yeah.
And I was at the border waiting for it to come through.
I mean, you had to sort of respect the geography of the country. I mean, on the Western Australian, South Australian, Northern Territory border, not a lot of people moving backwards and forwards on the border to go to work every day.
Not like New
visit
South
the
Wales and
doctor or go to
Queensland?
school. But New South Wales, Queensland border, it's one urban area. And similarly along the Victoria, New South Wales border, places like Albury, Wodonga and so on, but not just those sort of towns that were right on the river there. And look, I thought the New South Wales Victoria border was, there were times when it was managed really well. There were other times when it got a bit hard. But I mean, to be honest, everyone was trying to do their best. All the premiers were trying to do their best. And when you add it all up, yep, there were some inconvenient times and there were some decisions that you might have done differently. But the end result, better than almost anywhere else in the world.
Something about being Prime Minister. What's something you don't think a lot of us would know? Day-to-day people, you're in the office and you think, I don't think most people would know I have to do these kind of things.
It's a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me, but one of the things that's very hard to do as Prime Minister, as opposed to, say, when I was Treasurer. When I was Treasurer, I lived here in the Shire. I
come home every day.
I come home every day. I'd still see my neighbours, I'd still see the same people up at the cafe in the morning. The girls would go to school locally. They did when I was Prime Minister too, but you were more around that. Obviously, when I was Treasurer, I was incredibly busy and travelling a lot as well. But you were still sort of rooted at home in the suburbs of a major city like Sydney, and that gave you just an everyday connection with what was happening. When you become Prime Minister, they put you in a residence with big walls around it. They surround you with security 24/7. And that's all necessary. There's not an alternative to that. That's just how it has to be.
Fair enough.
But it does make it hard. It really does make it hard. And you make a conscious effort about it to try and maintain those connections as much as you can. That's why I'd go to the footy. That's
Sharks games.
Yeah, that's why I'd go down to the beach and go for a swim. That's why I'd walk the dog. That's why I would, stay in touch with friends and things like that. But it wasn't the same.
Was it a quick change from being Treasurer and then being in a, security, closed walls?
Yeah,
was that a big difference straight away?
When you're an immigration minister, you make lots of decisions that have quite personal implications for individuals. And so you can get some very highly motivated individuals who don't like an outcome of a particular thing, and you never know what they can do. And that's why, our immigration ministers, home affairs ministers, they have that protective security. It's the same reason why family court judges have protective security. When there are decisions that are made, and maybe people don't realise this, but when you serve in public office, particularly in some portfolios, you take on a personal risk. Prime ministers always have have that risk.
Leaders of countries
probably
the most risky, right?
But I have good friends who have served as secretaries of government in other countries, who continue to have protective security now because of the strong positions they took against countries like Iran and things like that. Those enemies never give up, and they may well have protective security for the rest of their lives. Fortunately, I don't.
Who decides who gets
the
security?
AFP, the Australian Federal Police,
okay.
make the decision, and they make assessments, and they're amazing people. And Jenny and I are very grateful to them. They almost became like family for those almost 4 years we were together, and there are a couple of Shark supporters on there, so they didn't terribly mind it when I'd go to the games. They still don't.
Perks of the job.
Yeah, I think sometimes they were watching the football a bit more than they were watching me, but that's okay. We're all fans.
Working hard, protected. And then, what was one of your favourite standout moments of being Prime Minister? Was there any particular moment you're like, I'm really proud of that work, or?
Oh, look, there were lots, and I've already mentioned many of them. The ability to pull together the AUKUS partnership really does stand out because it was so incredibly difficult. It took us almost a good 18 months. It was in late 2019 when I first had the idea.
Was it your idea?
It was.
The AUKUS was your idea?
Yeah, because I was concerned. At the time, we'd decided to build these French diesel submarines. And I was Treasurer at the time when that decision was made and sat on the National Security Committee. At that time, there was no decision before us to have nuclear-powered submarines. The difference between a diesel submarine and a nuclear-powered submarine is that nuclear-powered submarines are undetectable. So if you've got a diesel submarine, it has to do a thing called snorting, which is where it takes in air. And that has something to do with the batteries, I think. I'm not a diesel mechanic or engineer, but you can find them. They can go down for a while, but eventually they've got to come up for air. And
the nuclear ones can stay down.
They can stay down there for months and months and months and months and months, and their signatures are almost undetectable, if not undetectable, particularly the most advanced technology. And so, for the sort of things that a country would have submarines for, nuclear-powered submarines are, it's the difference between a Ferrari and a Kia. and an I-30. I'm not talking about some of the nicer Kias.
The lower one.
You get plenty of nice Kias these days, but
we're not talking about those.
No, that's really the difference. An I-30 and a Ferrari, and that's the difference in the capability as well. But they're incredibly difficult to build and to crew. You need amazing skills for the sailors who'll sail those ships. But we needed them. Back when we made the decision for the French submarines, we didn't have that as an option before us. So we're building those French submarines. They'd missed some key milestones. I was starting to worry about that, and I thought, well, we're going to need a plan B here if these guys stuff this up.
So they were already in production?
No. Well, they were in the early design phases. We were, planning shipyards and doing all those sorts of things, and we were working with the French over in France.
Had construction begun, like building stuff?
No, not yet.
No, okay.
And because there's so much prep.
I can't imagine building a submarine.
The prep on the design and all these sort of things.
Not like a DIY.
And they had to modify the design from the original one. Anyway, but they'd missed some key milestones.
Yep.
So I was worried. And so I thought, well, how about for once, can Plan B be better than Plan A? Like, do we have to go for something worse if the best one doesn't come off? So we decided to have a go. and
you got to go from the US.
We did, but it took a long time. The way these things work, the nuclear-powered submarine technology of the order that the United States has is only, they developed it. They shared it with the United Kingdom back in the late 50s. No other country has had access to it since then.
How did New Zealand get in on this then?
They didn't. They're not in.
Oh, it's Australia.
It's Australia, UK, and the US, and neither's Canada. But plenty of countries had asked the US before, heaps of them, and they'd always said no. Australia had sought it under previous prime ministers, and it had been denied. And so we took the view that the only way we were going to get a yes on this was you had to convince the United States, what I call their system, which is the nuclear naval establishment, the ones who sign off on the safety and the reactors and how it works and all of this. You had to convince all the experts first. I mean, I could have gone and seen Donald Trump, who I got on with very well, and said, Donald would love to do this. I'm quite sure he would have said yes immediately. But I suspect when Donald went back to see the Pentagon, they would have found 50,000 reasons why it shouldn't happen. So I wanted to make sure that when I put the question, whether to the president, and it ended up being President Biden, not President Trump, because we hadn't got to that stage yet when President Trump was in office. He probably was even unaware of it, that we were having these discussions. I don't know, I've never asked him. But we convinced them first, the experts in their system. And so when it came time for President Biden and his staff, when they went to the system, they went, we should have a go at this. The Australians, we think, you know, we'll have to be convinced, but, you know, don't say no. It wasn't a full yes at that point, but we got them to a not no. And so we put the political point, and I went to, and I linked up with Boris, and we put it both to Joe, and it took us a few months after that, from June through to September, and we made that announcement, and it sort of changed the geopolitics of our region. China has only really been seriously contested on a couple of things in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
This was one of them. The Quad, which is a leaders' dialogue between Australia, the United States, India and Japan, that was another one. I was the founding member of that. With those
leaders. Where did you come up with these ideas?
Well, the Quad wasn't my idea, but it was part of Shinzo Abe's idea, the late Shinzo Abe, who was a great Prime Minister of Japan and just horrifically assassinated last year. Very, very sad.
I'm sorry to hear.
Yeah. Anyway, Shinzo was a champion for the Indo-Pacific and this quadrilateral partnership. And he and I had dinner in Darwin one night, and we talked about this, and you know we were very keen to progress it, and we ended up getting it elevated to a leaders' dialogue. Previously, ministers would talk to each other, but getting it to, as I said, leaders have got to carry the relationship. So we elevated to that. So there was a Quad, there was and there was the AUKUS. And that really started to change the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific and China's assertiveness, and China started to change tactics. As I said, I think the strategy is still the same, but it started to balance things up a lot more. Now, there's still a lot more work to do, but in terms of, you know, keeping Australia safe for the next 50 to 100 years, it's hard to go past AUKUS.
Yeah, and you think that Australia should be safe for the next 50, 100 years?
You've got to work at it. You can't take it for granted. Relationships have to be kept in good repair with our partners and alliances, and you've got to stick together, as we historically have, but it's important that we continue to do that. It's got nothing to do with, some critics of the relationship with the United States think we sell out our sovereignty to the United States. I profoundly disagree. I think such a position is naive to think that Australia can actually have great confidence in its security in our region. I mean, we're not a nuclear nation. We don't have nuclear weapons, nor do we want them.
We're pretty chill.
Sorry?
That's Australia's.
Yeah, we are.
But we can be relaxed.
We can, but we can't be naive about it. And so you do need powerful friends, and powerful friends who respect your sovereignty, which I believe the United States do. You know, we disagree with them on occasions, but you disagree with them in the context of a good relationship. But, you know, you've got to keep the good relationship in good repair. Otherwise, you know, you undermine your own defence.
How'd you find Trump and Biden dealing with them? What was that like? They
are very different people, incredibly.
How so?
Well, Joe is, if what you'd call an institutional veteran. Joe's a Washington politician.
Like a by-the-book kind of guy?
Well, he's been he's been vice president, he's been around a long time. He knows the system. He knows how it works. He understands the importance of institutions, of what they call multilateral relationships. So, you know, things like ASEAN and the Quad and all this sort of stuff. So he gets all of that formal...
So he knows what's going on?
Yeah, formal official politics and the global order and how it works, and understood the Australian relationship really, really well. And so, you know, he's a lot more orthodox in his approach. And, you know, he's not a young man, but... you know, plenty of people talked about that. Personally, I found him very good to deal with, particularly one-on-one. And he had a great respect for Australia and our capabilities and what we could do and the relationship. So he was the orthodox player. Donald was the complete opposite of that. Donald was a disruptor. In the same way in his business career, he was a political disruptor, and he was to their own system. That's not a bad thing. There were some things that needed disrupting. If it wasn't for Donald, then the world, I don't think, would have called out China in the way they have. And certainly, you know, we were doing it at the same time. And so we shared a lot of views about that. And I don't think any other president would have done that.
Was one more fun to hang out with? Was one easier to deal with in terms of a work relation? Is there anything you can tell us there?
Well, no, look, they were both extraordinary men. You don't get to be president of the United States and be hopeless. They both had...
Some seem to think so.
Yeah, I know.
Any leader.
Well, they've obviously never run a country. It's not as easy as they think. It's a bit like people looking at what you guys do off the diving board and go, oh, yeah, I reckon I could do that. Yeah, and
even 10 metre, you see from the side, you're like, okay, and you get up there and it's different.
And particularly off that high board.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that looks right. Up there, it's terrifying.
Have you jumped off before?
I have jumped.
Have you?
Not dived.
Okay, where at?
Oh, just at a Olympic pool somewhere off the top, but and some illegal jumping off a bridge when I was about a bit younger than you out in Penrith.
Rock jumping for fun, but I did a fair bit.
People shouldn't do that. Do not jump off the rail bridge at Penrith. I don't think you can. Back when I was a kid, you could.
We even had some in Manly. They put up steel poles like a fence. Yeah. And you know what, they just made it 2 metres higher. Yeah. People just started jumping off the fence.
So the point being that, people may think they know what you can do, but what you find out when you're in these roles is you have a lot less room than you think. Your window is very short, and there are a lot of other competing interests you got to balance off. Nothing is as simple as it seems. Commentators, I noticed, are full of opinions, but not a lot of practice. Yeah.
Did you ever feel misunderstood?
Oh, of course you do. But you don't whinge about that. That's just the nature of modern communications and media. Who is understood? Who is really understood? I'm sure no one is as they're portrayed, because there's too many others' interests in how people are portrayed. It's in people's interest to portray some people as this or that, and so that's the contestable nature of modern communication. So you should be prepared to give people a go, and don't believe what you read, even if it's good. The truth's somewhere in between. I found virtually all the people I dealt with in politics were well motivated, even if I disagreed pretty fundamentally with what I thought their ideas were. So you can disagree on what you think the best policy is. Where I find politics gets ugly is when it starts with, well, you're a bad person, therefore anything you say must be bad. Whatever your idea is, it must be bad. And we see a lot of that today, that hyper-partisanship. You see it in a lot of modern media. You see it, whatever comes out of that person's mouth could not be good. Well,
just because it's that person.
Just because it's that person, because that person is a bad person and I'm a good person. I don't mean me personally. That's that's how it works. Yeah. And there's so much of modern politics and communication basically trying to judge people whether they're good or bad. Well, Solzhenitsyn himself said, it runs down, good and evil runs down the middle of the human heart. We're all complex. But one of the things I think it's important in politics, whether you're actually formally in politics or you're just, talking about it, give people some credit that the reason they might be involved in public life is for good reasons.
Because a lot of your family served, right?
Oh, my dad did.
Firefighters, teachers.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, in public life, yeah. My dad was a policeman. My brother's a paramedic, and my brother-in-law was a firey. And so public service sort of runs in the genes. I chose politics, but people, by and large, do it for the right reasons. It's just not as easy as people think.
Why did you get into it? Was it a dream? Did little ScoMo want to be a Prime Minister?
My father was a local mayor, and so I was exposed to it at a relatively early age. And life's opportunities sort of went that way. And when I had the opportunity, I took it up because I saw it as a good way to serve and do something constructive and meaningful and useful. And when it all finished in May of 2022, I remember a conversation I had with Peter Costello before I went into government back in 2013. And I write about this in the book I've written, which comes out in May. he said to me as we finished our conversation, he said, "Oh, another thing, Scott, don't waste a day. It goes very fast." And when I finished up as PM after the loss in 2022, one of the things I didn't have regrets about was that I never felt I'd wasted a day. That doesn't mean I get everything right. It just means that I went into every day trying to do as much as I could. And if you feel like that at the end of a task, win, lose or draw, well, you can walk away with your head high, and over time, the things that you're able to accomplish remain, and the other fluff that goes on in the commentary on politics and the personality sort of sides of politics and all that, it all burns up.
So you walked away feeling
I gave everything I had,
Yeah.
and so when you feel like that, you can move on.
You do. Even a competition you go in, you don't necessarily win or get a medal. You're like, well, I trained hard, I competed well, and you know what? I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and there's always another day, and life goes on, and there's lots of opportunities.
So what's next for ScoMo? Do you have any goals for the future? What's your plan?
Oh, well, we'll see how that all plays out.
Okay.
We'll see how it all plays out. I think I've had my opportunity to serve in political life, and I've had more opportunity than most. I had 9 years as a cabinet minister, including almost 4 as a prime minister, 3 as a treasurer. Few people get that opportunity in political life, and I'm very grateful for it. And as I said, I don't feel like I wasted a day, and I think there's a lot to show for it. People may have disagreed with some of my policies and some of the things I did.
When you have to make a choice where a lot of people are going to disagree, a lot of people may agree, how do you make that decision?
Well, you just do what you think's right.
Yeah, okay. Best information at hand?
Best information at hand. And some decisions, there's politics involved, others there's not. You're naive to think there's not politics involved in decisions. Of course there is. I think we can be a bit purist and naive about some of these things. And when commentators look at them, there's a compilation of forces that are upon you, and it's difficult to manage. And different leaders lead in different times. A good example: when John Howard was Prime Minister, the relationship with China was completely different. Completely different. There was a different leader in the Communist Party in China. The nature of our economy was different. The size of our economy was different. The global economy was operating differently. Modern communications were not like they are today. Everyone governs in different times. And while there are lessons that you can draw from other leaders, and I certainly drew many from John or Robert Menzies or others, you've got to be careful about how much you sort of cut and paste.
Because they led in a different time.
You've got to govern for your time. You've got to govern for your time. And, sometimes I think, in the sort of the sorry phase we've been through, and, I've supported all of those apologies the Parliament have given. And I think they're quite right to do. But the thing we've got to be a bit careful of is it's okay for our generation to apologise for something that, happened 50 years ago. But let's not us be so vain to think that had we been there at the same time in the same environment, would we have done the same thing? How do you know? You can't take today's morality that you've acquired living in modern Australia and think you would have had exactly the same set of views, 50 or 100 years ago. I just think that's a bit vain. So not saying people mightn't have had the same view. There were certainly, if you go back to the anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce in the UK is a sort of a hero of mine. He was counterculture at the time, and he was incredibly brave. But he was a minority. So to think we would have all individually, who are now formed the majority on these things, would have been in the minority back then, maybe.
Yeah.
But, perhaps you got tickets on yourself.
You never know. I heard seatbelts only passed by one vote in Parliament.
Yeah.
At one stage, because it was a different time. Where now, if you put up a vote, everyone would say,
exactly.
Of course we need seatbelts.
I think we've got to be a little bit kinder on our history, and we've got to avoid the cancel culture.
It's big in the social media.
Yeah, this really troubles me, this cancel culture thing. It's about anything that cancels an individual. How can that be good? Like the person. It's not just their views. This is
It's putting him into that box you were talking about,
Yeah.
the bad person,
Yeah.
whatever you say is bad.
yeah, they may have said some bad things, of course. We'll take them on that. But you don't cancel them as a human being and their ability to make a contribution.
Did you ever feel cancelled? Or like tried to be?
Oh, I certainly was targeted. And I imagine there were plenty of attempts. I don't think they succeeded. But, as a politician, you lose a fair bit of paint and or bark. And, there are unfair things said and done. But look, again, you don't complain about it. It's
get on with
It's
it?
their conditions. That's the conditions. I had a great rugby coach who passed away recently. And I remember a game we were playing. It was a semi-final. And we're playing it on the old Sydney Cricket Ground number 2. It doesn't exist now. And we're playing, I think it was North Sydney Boys, and I was at Sydney Boys. And they weren't a bad side, North Sydney Boys. But it was really, really windy that day. And on windy days, you tend to get a bit scatty. And he said, look, you can't do anything about it. It's windy out there, and you guys have got to concentrate, 10 times harder than you normally do to stay focused on the game plan and stick to it. And so your task today is to remain incredibly disciplined because the wind is going to mess with you. And I'll never forget that. And it was a great lesson in you got to play on the field that's there. You don't get, I don't want to play on a windy field. We're going to go over the other side and we're going to play over there because our game plan only works over there.
Can't postpone it to next week.
No, you can't. No, I'm not going at this venue. I'm going to go at the other one. You got to play where the tournament is.
Cards dealt at hand.
Exactly. And so, you can't complain about the wind. You got to deal with it. And so, the media can be annoying, but that's the field. People are going to attack you unfairly.
You see it like the wind.
Yeah, just, get over it. Is it unfair? Yeah, often. But if you're looking for fair, don't go into politics. Pick another profession.
Yeah, my dad always says, life's not fair, but it's still good.
Yeah, well, I think your father is very wise.
And I know you love your sport, so I brought a little thing for you to have a look at.
Yeah.
Now, last week we competed in the Oceania Championships.
Yeah.
And I won the competition, winning this medal, securing Australia a position in the next Olympic Games.
Oh, mate, that is.
Love you have a look at it.
Let me have a look. Look at this. Here we go. Look, this is an amazing achievement.
I appreciate it.
What I love about the achievement is it wasn't just your achievement, but it was a country's achievement, and you've done something for your country, not just for yourself. And I think that's terrific.
It's an honour every time we compete for Australia. You feel very honoured, very grateful, and because this was an international event, when you win and they play the national anthem,
Mate, it's special. I mean,
very special.
I don't know what that feels like. I've heard the national anthem quite a few times, but it's never been while I've been wearing a rugby jersey or a rugby league jersey or something like that, or let alone the Speedos. That would not be something you'd want to see. And that is tremendous that you've been able to do that for the country. The other thing is, it blazes a trail. I mean, you know how hard it is to do what you do. And there are plenty of other young people doing exactly the same thing. You just made their pathway that bit easier.
I appreciate it. ScoMo, thanks for coming on today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
No, I've enjoyed it.
And hopefully we can speak again very soon.
Well, all the best in Paris.
I still have to qualify for me personally. So
You've got the Australian ticket. You booked those seats on the plane. We just got to get you on that plane
yes,
now.
exactly.